The narcissist did not expect the goodbye to become real. When they said it, it sounded absolute, final, clean. But inside their mind, it was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to trigger something inside you, a reaction, a protest, a last emotional surge that would pull you back into the gravitational field of the relationship. Because in most narcissistic dynamics, goodbye is not an ending. It is a mechanism, a lever, a pressure point designed to see how strongly you are still attached. They say, "I'm done," but what they often mean is something closer to, "Convince me otherwise. Chase me. Show me that I still matter enough for you to fight." And for a long time, that pattern works. The narcissist leaves, you explain, they withdraw. You reach out. They close the door halfway, waiting to see how desperately you will knock. Every cycle quietly reinforces the same belief in their mind. You will not truly disappear. You might pause. You might get angry. You might even say your own goodbye. But eventually you will return to the role, the relationship assigned to you. The one who tries to fix things. The one who seeks closure. The one who cannot tolerate the silence. But something changes the day you stop responding to the script. The narcissist says goodbye the same way they always have, with that familiar mixture of cold certainty and hidden expectation, and this time something unusual happens. Nothing. No message arrives hours later. No emotional paragraph explaining your pain. No attempt to reopen the conversation. The silence stretches into days, then weeks, and at first, the narcissist interprets it through the only framework they know. You are processing. You are playing a game. You are waiting for the right moment to reach out. But as time continues to pass, a quiet disturbance begins forming beneath the surface of their certainty. Because the one thing narcissistic psychology depends on more than affection, more than admiration, more even than control, is reflection. They exist through the reactions of others, through the emotional echoes that confirm their presence in someone else's inner world. When you argue, they are confirmed. When you defend yourself, they are confirmed. When you try to explain your hurt, they are confirmed. Even your anger proves they still occupy space inside your mind. But when you disappear without noise, something much stranger happens. The mirror goes dark. And this is the moment the narcissist never anticipated. Because losing a person is one thing. Losing the reflection of themselves inside that person is something else entirely. In the language of Carl Jung, the narcissist depends on what psychologists call a mirrored self-object, someone who reflects their image back to them so consistently that it stabilizes their identity. You were never just a partner, a friend, or a lover. You were also a surface, a psychological mirror where they could see themselves as important, desired, powerful, or misunderstood. And when that mirror suddenly vanishes, the narcissist does not immediately feel heartbreak. What they feel first is disruption, a strange interruption in the narrative they assumed would always continue. Because the goodbye they gave you was supposed to start another chapter, not close the book. The moment the narcissist realizes you did not chase rarely arrives in a dramatic flash. It unfolds slowly, almost quietly, like a delayed echo that takes time to reach them. At first, nothing seems unusual from their perspective. After the goodbye, they assume the familiar sequence will follow, a few hours of silence, maybe a day, then the message will come. It always has before. The apology, the explanation, the emotional paragraph, attempting to reopen the conversation. Even if you are angry, that anger still fits inside the script they expect, because anger means engagement. It means you are still orbiting the relationship. So when the silence begins, the narcissist does not panic. They interpret it through the lens of past experience. You are processing, you are cooling down, you are preparing your response. In their mind, the story is simply pausing before the next act. But time has a strange effect on psychological expectations. As the hours turn into days and the days into weeks, something subtle begins to shift inside the narcissist's awareness. The absence of your reaction slowly becomes harder to explain. Normally, by this point, the emotional gravity of the relationship would have pulled you back into contact. The narcissist has relied on this pattern for a long time. They have watched it happen with other people, and often with you. Conflict escalates. Distance appears. Then eventually someone reopens the channel. The dynamic resumes. That rhythm becomes so predictable that they stop questioning it. It becomes part of the invisible architecture of the relationship. But this time, the rhythm breaks. At first, the narcissist looks for small explanations. Maybe you are busy. Maybe you are trying to prove a point. Maybe you are waiting for them to reach out first. They scroll through their messages, rereading the last exchange to see if they missed something. They revisit the tone of the conversation. Was it harsher than usual? Did they push too far? But even these questions are not motivated by guilt. They are attempts to restore the narrative, to find a version of events that still leads to the same outcome they expect. Eventually, you will reappear. What the narcissist struggles to recognize is that the relationship has quietly entered unfamiliar territory. For the first time, the usual emotional signals are missing. There is no tension building toward reconciliation, no visible struggle for closure, no attempt to renegotiate the ending. From their perspective, the emotional stage has suddenly gone dark. And when that happens, something more unsettling begins to emerge beneath the surface of their confidence. A small, almost reluctant thought begins to form. What if you actually accepted the goodbye? This possibility feels foreign to the narcissistic mind, not because it is logically impossible, but because it contradicts the role they assigned to you. Within their internal story, you were the one who tried to repair the relationship, the one who explained feelings, the one who could not tolerate unresolved endings. Your emotional investment was part of the structure that made the dynamic work. Without it, the system begins to malfunction. When the narcissist says goodbye, they expect resistance. Resistance confirms importance. Resistance confirms attachment. But acceptance removes that confirmation entirely. This is the moment when the psychological shift truly begins. The narcissist notices something they did not anticipate: the absence of pursuit. There is no late-night message, no attempt to clarify misunderstandings, no indirect signals through social media. Your silence does not feel dramatic. In fact, it feels strangely calm. But that calmness becomes precisely what makes it unsettling, because the narcissist cannot easily interpret it as pain, anger, or strategy. And when behavior cannot be easily categorized, the mind begins searching for explanations. Gradually, the realization becomes harder to avoid. The goodbye they delivered may have triggered something very different from what they expected. Instead of starting another cycle of emotional negotiation, it may have ended the dynamic entirely. The narcissist did not lose control through a confrontation. They lost it through something much quieter: your refusal to participate in the familiar pattern. And that is the moment when the story inside their mind begins to fracture. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a script that suddenly no longer matches the behavior of the other actor, because the narcissist assumed the relationship would always follow the same structure: departure, reaction, reconciliation. The goodbye was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to provoke movement. But when the movement never arrives, the narcissist faces something they rarely encounter: a situation they cannot easily pull back into their control. The moment the narcissist realizes you did not chase rarely arrives as a dramatic revelation. There is no sudden scene where they sit down and consciously admit that something fundamental has changed. Instead, the realization unfolds slowly, almost reluctantly, as if their mind is resisting the conclusion for as long as possible. At first, they assume the familiar pattern will continue. The goodbye was simply another movement in a cycle that has repeated many times before. Distance appears, emotions intensify, and eventually the other person reaches out. The narcissist has seen this rhythm unfold in many relationships, and often in this one as well. It becomes so predictable that they stop questioning it. The goodbye, in their mind, is not an ending. It is a stimulus, a signal that will soon provoke movement. So when the silence begins, the narcissist does not immediately interpret it as finality. Silence can mean many things. It can mean anger. It can mean wounded pride. It can mean someone is waiting for the other person to make the first move. Within the logic of narcissistic relationships, silence often precedes another emotional escalation. The narcissist expects the tension to build quietly before breaking into another conversation, another attempt to repair, another cycle of explanation and reconciliation. In other words, the silence is initially interpreted as part of the game. But as the days pass, something begins to feel different. Normally, by now, the emotional gravity of the relationship would have pulled you back into communication. Even if you were hurt, even if you had sworn never to speak again, something usually brings the connection back to life. A late-night message. A question that sounds neutral but carries emotional weight. A moment of vulnerability that reopens the door. The narcissist has learned to expect these signals because they confirm something very important to their internal worldview, that they remain psychologically significant to you. When those signals never arrive, the narcissist begins to revisit the final interaction in their mind. They replay the conversation with increasing attention to detail, the tone of your voice, the timing of your last message, the emotional atmosphere of the goodbye itself. They search for clues that might explain the silence without forcing them to confront its real meaning. Perhaps you are simply busy. Perhaps you are trying to prove a point. Perhaps you are waiting for them to break the silence first. Each of these explanations protects the same assumption, that the dynamic is still intact. But time gradually weakens those interpretations. The longer the silence lasts, the more difficult it becomes to believe that nothing has changed. The narcissist starts to sense that the emotional rhythm they relied on has broken. In the past, conflict always generated movement. Withdrawal produced pursuit. Distance created curiosity. The system was self-sustaining because both people remained psychologically engaged. Now the system is quiet, and the quiet feels unfamiliar. This is where a subtle shift begins to occur inside the narcissist's perception. For the first time, they start considering a possibility that had not previously seemed real. You may not be coming back. This thought does not arrive comfortably. It often appears briefly and is quickly dismissed. The narcissistic mind is designed to protect the ego from destabilizing interpretations. Accepting that someone has truly detached would mean accepting the loss of influence over that person's emotional world. And for a personality structured around control and reflection, that realization is deeply unsettling. So the narcissist tests reality in small ways. They may check whether you are active online. They may notice whether you have removed traces of the relationship from your social presence. They may casually ask a mutual acquaintance how you are doing. These actions are rarely driven by longing in the romantic sense. They are driven by curiosity mixed with disbelief. The narcissist is trying to determine whether the silence represents a temporary pause or something more permanent. The most confusing part for them is the absence of emotional noise. In previous cycles, the relationship was always full of signals. Even conflict created a sense of connection because it confirmed emotional investment. But your silence does not provide that confirmation. It does not accuse. It does not defend. It simply withdraws. And because there is nothing to argue with, the narcissist cannot easily react. The emotional stage remains empty. Eventually, the realization becomes harder to ignore. The goodbye they delivered may not have triggered another round of negotiation. Instead, it may have ended the relationship's entire psychological structure. The narcissist expected movement, resistance, or pursuit. They expected some form of reaction that would re-establish the familiar dynamic. But what they encounter instead is something they rarely experience: acceptance. And this is the moment when the meaning of the goodbye quietly changes. What was once intended as a maneuver within the relationship suddenly becomes the event that closed it. The narcissist did not plan for that outcome. They assumed the story would continue because it always had before. But your refusal to chase has altered the trajectory completely. The cycle that once defined the relationship has stopped producing motion. And in that stillness, the narcissist begins to understand something they never anticipated when they said goodbye. This time the ending may actually be real. What unsettles the narcissist most is not your anger, not your criticism, and not even your rejection. What unsettles them most is your silence. Because silence introduces a psychological condition that narcissistic personalities struggle deeply to tolerate: the loss of narrative control. In most narcissistic relationships, the narcissist assumes they are the author of the story. They define when closeness begins. They define when distance appears. They decide when conflict escalates and when reconciliation becomes possible again. Even the act of leaving is often part of this narrative authority. When they say goodbye, they imagine themselves directing the emotional trajectory that will follow. The goodbye is meant to provoke reaction, and the reaction allows them to remain the central figure in the emotional landscape. But when your response is silence, the story suddenly stops responding to their direction. At first, this disruption feels subtle. The narcissist notices that the usual emotional feedback is missing. There is no protest, no explanation, no attempt to repair what has broken. In most previous conflicts, this stage would have been full of energy. Messages sent late at night. Long paragraphs attempting to clarify misunderstandings. Questions about what went wrong. Even anger would have provided a sense of movement. Emotional tension reassures the narcissist that the connection still exists. It tells them that the relationship remains psychologically alive. But when silence replaces that tension, something different occurs. The relationship no longer produces emotional data. It becomes a blank space where information used to be. For a narcissistic personality, this loss of feedback is deeply destabilizing. Narcissists rely heavily on what psychologists sometimes describe as mirrors of identity. These mirrors are not literal reflections, but emotional responses from others that confirm who the narcissist believes themselves to be. Admiration reflects their sense of superiority. Desire reflects their attractiveness. Even conflict reflects their importance in another person's emotional life. As long as someone reacts strongly, the narcissist receives confirmation that they still occupy psychological space in that person's world. But silence removes the mirror entirely. Without reflection, the narcissist cannot easily measure their influence. The emotional surface that once confirmed their importance suddenly disappears. Carl Jung often wrote about the ego's dependence on stable psychological structures. The ego prefers environments where identity can be continuously reinforced. Narcissistic personalities take this dependence to an extreme. They construct relational environments that constantly echo their significance back to them. This is why they often provoke emotional reactions in others. The reaction itself becomes proof of their psychological impact. But when you withdraw without resistance, You interrupt this system of reflection. The narcissist is no longer receiving confirmation of their emotional presence inside your life. Instead of seeing themselves mirrored through your reactions, they encounter something far more difficult to interpret: absence. This absence creates a kind of psychological vacuum. The narcissist begins searching for explanations that might restore clarity. They may revisit memories of the relationship, replaying conversations in their mind to locate the moment where things shifted. They might wonder whether you are simply waiting before reaching out again. They might imagine that you are trying to provoke a response from them. In other words, the narcissistic mind initially attempts to reinterpret silence as another form of communication, because accepting that the connection has truly dissolved would require them to accept something that threatens their internal narrative, that they no longer control the emotional outcome. Another unsettling element of silence is that it removes the narcissist's ability to close the story on their own terms. Narcissistic personalities prefer endings that reinforce their identity. If the relationship ends, they want to feel that they were the one who walked away. They want to believe they remain psychologically significant even after the separation. When you respond with anger or pleading, that significance remains intact. The narcissist can interpret your reaction as proof that they still matter. But silence denies them that reassurance. It refuses to confirm the importance they assume they hold in your inner world. Over time, this creates a quiet but persistent discomfort. The narcissist begins to sense that something fundamental has shifted. The goodbye they once used as a lever of control has produced an outcome they did not predict. Instead of triggering another cycle of emotional engagement, it has removed them from the center of the narrative altogether. And that realization introduces one of the most destabilizing experiences for a narcissistic personality: the possibility that someone they once controlled emotionally has stepped entirely outside the system that gave them influence. When the narcissist finally accepts that the silence is real, something unexpected begins to form beneath the surface of their mind. It is not immediate regret, it is not remorse, and it is rarely the kind of romantic longing that people often imagine. What begins instead is a quieter and more complicated psychological process: fixation. The narcissist becomes mentally occupied with a situation they cannot easily explain. Human psychology is deeply uncomfortable with unfinished narratives. When a story ends clearly, the mind moves on. Even painful endings eventually settle into memory. But when a story ends without explanation, without conflict, without emotional closure, the mind keeps returning to it. It searches for missing information. It replays past events. It tries to resolve the tension that was never released. For the narcissist, your silence creates exactly this type of unresolved psychological loop. In the past, every conflict between you followed a familiar trajectory. Tension appeared, words were exchanged, emotions escalated. Eventually, the dynamic reset itself in some form. Even the most painful arguments still produced a sense of movement. Something always happened next. But now the pattern has stopped mid-sentence. The narcissist expected the relationship to continue reacting to their behavior. Instead, the reaction has disappeared completely. At first, this creates curiosity. The narcissist wonders what you are thinking. They may ask themselves questions they rarely asked before. Are you still angry? Are you relieved that the relationship ended? Are you thinking about them at all? The most unsettling question, however, remains unspoken. Have you already moved on? Because narcissistic personalities depend heavily on psychological reflection, they tend to assume they remain present in the thoughts of people who once cared about them. Even when relationships end badly, the narcissist often believes they still occupy emotional space in the other person's inner world. Conflict, resentment, even hatred would still confirm that importance. But silence offers no such confirmation. It introduces the possibility that the narcissist may have simply faded out of your psychological landscape. This uncertainty begins to pull the narcissist's attention back toward the relationship again and again. They may start checking small details that once seemed unimportant. They might notice whether you are active online. They might search for subtle clues in your social media posts that suggest how you are feeling. If they see you appearing calm or content, the image may linger in their mind longer than they expect. Not because they necessarily miss you, but because the calm contradicts the narrative they assumed would unfold. The narcissist often expected a different outcome. They imagined that their absence would create emotional turbulence in your life. They expected confusion, longing, or at least visible distress. That reaction would confirm their psychological importance. But when your life appears to continue without dramatic disruption, the narcissist encounters something that challenges their assumptions about influence. This is the stage where a quiet form of obsession can begin to develop. It is rarely dramatic or visible from the outside. The narcissist may not even consciously describe it as obsession. Instead, it appears as repeated curiosity. They think about the relationship at unexpected moments. A place you once visited together may trigger a memory. A song, a phrase, or a random moment during the day might bring your image back into their mind. These thoughts are not necessarily affectionate. In many cases, they are analytical. The narcissist is trying to reconstruct the sequence of events that led to the silence. They want to understand when the dynamic slipped beyond their control. But because the final moment contained no confrontation, no emotional explosion, and no dramatic explanation, the answer remains unclear. The mind continues returning to the puzzle. Carl Jung wrote that what remains unconscious tends to return in indirect forms. When the psyche cannot fully process an event, it often repeats fragments of it internally. This is particularly true for personalities that rely on control as a way of stabilizing their identity. The narcissist cannot easily integrate the idea that someone they once influenced emotionally has simply stepped outside the system. So the mind circles around the experience, attempting to reinterpret it. At times, the narcissist may even feel a strange impulse to reach out again. Not necessarily to reconcile, but to reopen the narrative. A brief message could test whether the psychological connection still exists. A casual comment could provoke the emotional reaction they are accustomed to receiving. If you respond, the unresolved loop closes instantly. The old dynamic restarts. But if you remain silent, the fixation deepens. Because now the narcissist is confronted with a possibility that is difficult for their ego to accept. The story they believed they controlled may have ended without their permission. The emotional stage where they once held a central role may have continued without them. And in the quiet space left behind by your absence, the narcissist begins to experience something rare for their psychological structure. A lingering awareness that the relationship no longer revolves around them. When the narcissist begins to realize that your silence is not temporary, another shift quietly takes place beneath the surface of the dynamic. What is changing is not only the emotional distance between you. What is changing is the structure of power that once defined the relationship. In most narcissistic dynamics, power does not appear as domination in an obvious sense. It is more subtle than that. It lives in patterns of reaction. The narcissist learns which behaviors create emotional movement in the other person. They learn which words provoke defense, which silences trigger pursuit, and which withdrawals cause the other person to return with renewed intensity. Over time, these patterns become predictable. The narcissist begins to rely on them without even thinking about it. In this sense, the relationship operates almost like a closed psychological system. One person produces an action, the other produces a reaction. That reaction confirms influence. Influence reinforces the narcissist's sense of control. and control keeps the system stable. As long as both people continue responding to one another, the structure remains intact. Conflict may exist, but even conflict feeds the system because it maintains emotional movement. Your silence interrupts this entire mechanism. When you accept the goodbye and refuse to chase, the expected reaction never arrives. The narcissist produces an action withdrawal, but the emotional consequence they anticipated does not follow. In psychological terms, the feedback loop collapses. The behavior that once generated control suddenly produces nothing. And when a behavior stops producing results, the sense of power attached to it begins to weaken. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of psychic energy in relationships. Emotional attention, reactions, arguments, and attempts to resolve conflict all carry energy. In narcissistic dynamics, much of this energy flows toward the narcissist. Even when the relationship is painful, the emotional investment keeps them at the center of the psychological field. But when you withdraw your reactions, the energy begins to move elsewhere. The narcissist no longer receives the constant reinforcement that previously sustained the dynamic. This shift can feel profoundly disorienting for them, because from their perspective, nothing dramatic has happened. They said goodbye just as they have before. They expected the familiar sequence of reactions to follow. Yet the outcome is completely different. The goodbye that once functioned as leverage now behaves like a real ending. And because the narcissist did not intend for the goodbye to become permanent, they experience the loss of control as something confusing rather than predictable. The most destabilizing part of this shift is the calmness with which it occurs. If you had left in anger, the narcissist could interpret the situation as conflict. Conflict still places them inside the emotional center of the relationship. If you had pleaded or argued, they could view your reaction as confirmation of their influence. But when you leave quietly, without protest and without explanation, the narcissist loses the emotional framework they normally rely on to interpret events. Your silence communicates something that narcissistic personalities rarely expect: independence. Not independence in the dramatic sense of rebellion or confrontation, but independence in the psychological sense. It signals that your emotional state no longer depends on their responses. You are no longer negotiating the relationship's meaning through constant interaction. Instead, you have stepped outside the system entirely. For the narcissist, this creates a paradox. The very action they use to maintain power, saying goodbye, withdrawing, creating distance, now removes that power. The strategy no longer produces the same results. Instead of triggering pursuit, it produces absence. Instead of drawing emotional energy toward them, it redirects that energy away from them. This is why making their goodbye permanent changes the dynamic so completely. It transforms the meaning of the original action. What was intended as a maneuver within the relationship becomes the event that ended the relationship's psychological structure. The narcissist believed they were still directing the narrative. But the moment you accepted the ending without resistance, the narrative quietly moved beyond their control. And this is where the balance of influence truly shifts. Not because you defeated the narcissist, and not because you forced them into regret. The shift occurs because you stop participating in the mechanism that once allowed them to regulate the relationship. By refusing to chase, argue, or reopen the emotional loop, you remove the system that gave their behavior power. In the silence that follows, the narcissist begins to encounter something unfamiliar, a relationship that no longer revolves around their reactions. The psychological gravity that once pulled both of you into repeated cycles has weakened. And without that gravitational pull, the dynamic that once seemed impossible to escape suddenly loses its structure entirely. After the power dynamic quietly shifts, another subtle change can sometimes appear in the narcissist's perception of you. It does not happen in every case, and it rarely looks like admiration in the conventional sense. But occasionally, The narcissist begins to view you through a different psychological lens, not with affection, not with warmth, but with a kind of distant, reluctant respect. This reaction surprises many people because it seems contradictory. Narcissists are often described as individuals who lack genuine respect for others. In many ways, this description is accurate. Narcissistic personalities tend to value people primarily for the roles they play within the narcissist's psychological system. Some individuals are valued for admiration, others for loyalty, others for emotional responsiveness. But when someone consistently fulfills those roles, the narcissist rarely interprets it as strength. Instead, they interpret it as availability. Availability, in the narcissistic worldview, often becomes synonymous with predictability, and predictability reduces psychological tension. The narcissist knows how to provoke a reaction, how to restore connection, and how to maintain their position at the center of the relationship. In that environment, the other person may be deeply important to the narcissist's emotional regulation, but they are not perceived as autonomous in a meaningful sense. Their responses follow patterns that the narcissist understands. When you refuse to chase after the goodbye, however, that predictability disappears. Your behavior stops fitting the role that the narcissist assigned to you. Instead of remaining emotionally accessible, you become psychologically unavailable. And this change alters the way the narcissist interprets your position in the relationship. Carl Jung wrote that the psyche tends to respect what it cannot easily control. When a person behaves in ways that resist manipulation or prediction, they introduce uncertainty into the psychological field. Narcissistic personalities, despite their desire for control, often feel a strange fascination with individuals who operate outside their influence. The inability to provoke a reaction creates a new kind of psychological distance. Your silence becomes a signal that something fundamental has changed in your orientation toward the relationship. You are no longer seeking validation from the narcissist. You are no longer negotiating your emotional position through arguments or explanations. Instead, you have stepped away without demanding recognition for doing so. From the narcissist's perspective, this creates a paradoxical impression. On one hand, they may still attempt to minimize the importance of the relationship. They might tell themselves that the ending was inevitable, or that the connection was never particularly meaningful. Narcissistic defense mechanisms often push them to maintain a sense of superiority over past relationships. But beneath those rationalizations, another perception may quietly emerge. The person who once reacted to everything has stopped reacting. The person who once tried to repair the relationship has stopped trying. The person who once explained their feelings has stopped explaining. This shift can alter the narcissist's internal narrative about you. You are no longer categorized as someone who remained emotionally dependent on the relationship. Instead, you become an anomaly within their memory of interpersonal dynamics, a person who did not behave according to the usual script. In some cases, this anomaly produces curiosity. In others, it produces a subtle form of respect that the narcissist rarely expresses openly. It is not the respect that comes from admiration or appreciation. Rather, it is the respect that comes from encountering someone who proved psychologically difficult to control. Narcissistic personalities often divide the people in their lives into predictable roles: admirers, rivals, supporters, critics. But when someone exits the relationship without drama and without pursuit, that person becomes harder to categorize. They do not behave like a rival because they are not competing. They do not behave like a critic because they are not arguing. And they do not behave like an admirer because they have withdrawn their attention. This ambiguity can remain in the narcissist's mind for a long time. Your image becomes associated with a moment where the expected dynamic stopped functioning. And because narcissists rely heavily on patterns to navigate relationships, The memory of someone who broke that pattern often remains psychologically distinct. This does not mean the narcissist suddenly understands the relationship or regrets their behavior. Insight is not guaranteed. But the psychological impression you leave behind may be different from the one they expected. Instead of remembering someone who pleaded for connection, they remember someone who quietly stepped outside the dynamic altogether. And in the world of narcissistic psychology, that kind of departure carries a weight that loud endings rarely achieve. In the end, what changes the narcissistic dynamic is not confrontation. It is not revenge. It is not a dramatic declaration that you are finally done. The real shift happens in something much quieter: acceptance. When the narcissist said goodbye, they believed they were controlling the direction of the relationship. In their mind, the goodbye was not the end of the story. It was a movement within the story, a strategic pause, a moment designed to provoke reaction and pull the emotional gravity of the relationship back toward them. This assumption is built into the psychology of many narcissistic dynamics. The narcissist leaves, expecting pursuit. They withdraw, expecting curiosity. They create distance, expecting the other person to close it again. Each cycle reinforces the same belief: the relationship will continue responding to their behavior. That belief becomes so deeply embedded that the narcissist rarely considers another outcome. But when you accept the goodbye without resistance, something unexpected happens. The meaning of the goodbye changes completely. What was intended as a maneuver suddenly becomes a final event. The action that was supposed to provoke emotional movement instead produces stillness, and that stillness transforms the structure of the relationship. Carl Jung wrote that psychological transformation often begins the moment an individual withdraws their unconscious participation from a pattern. Many relational dynamics continue not because they are healthy, but because both individuals remain unconsciously invested in repeating them. The arguments repeat. The reconciliations repeat. The emotional negotiations repeat. The pattern survives because both people continue to move inside its boundaries. When you stop reacting, the pattern loses its energy source. The emotional exchanges that once kept the dynamic alive no longer appear. The cycle that once seemed impossible to escape begins to dissolve. And when the cycle dissolves, the narcissist no longer occupies the psychological center they once held in your life. This is the final reversal that the narcissist rarely expects. For a long time, the relationship revolved around their actions and your reactions. They defined the pace of closeness and distance. They influenced the emotional direction of the connection. But when you step outside the dynamic, that structure collapses. Not through conflict, but through absence. The narcissist may spend a long time trying to interpret this change. They may revisit the relationship in their mind, searching for a moment where the dynamic could have been restored. But the truth is often simpler than they expect. The dynamic ended the moment you stopped participating in it. This does not mean the narcissist suddenly understands the relationship or accepts responsibility for what happened. Insight is not guaranteed. Many narcissists continue protecting their self-image through rationalization and denial. But regardless of how they interpret the past, one fact remains unchanged. The goodbye they gave you no longer belongs to them. Once you accepted it, the meaning of that goodbye moved beyond their control. It became part of your decision rather than their strategy. And in that moment, the dynamic that once seemed dominated by their influence quietly shifted. The narcissist believed they were ending a chapter in a story that would continue. But by refusing to chase, you did something they never anticipated. You closed the book. If this message resonated with you, it may be because you have already experienced something that many people struggle to understand. The moment when silence becomes stronger than explanation. When walking away quietly changes more than any argument ever could. Narcissistic dynamics often survive through reaction. through the endless exchange of words, emotions, and attempts to fix what was never meant to be stable. But the moment you stop feeding that cycle, the structure begins to collapse on its own. The most important thing to remember is this: accepting the ending does not mean you lost the relationship. In many cases, it means you finally stepped outside a system that was designed to keep you emotionally trapped. The narcissist may continue interpreting the story in ways that protect their self-image. They may never fully understand why the dynamic ended. But your healing does not depend on their understanding. It depends on the moment you reclaim your own psychological center. If you found insight in this exploration of narcissistic psychology and Carl Jung's ideas about identity, shadow, and emotional detachment, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we examine the deeper patterns that shape relationships, power, and personal transformation. And if this video helped you see your own experience more clearly, share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful step forward begins with recognizing that your silence was not weakness. It was the moment you chose your own peace